Hello, Sego and Degweno Horado. Welcome to tonight's virtual talk from the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. Tonight's talk is titled Wâpahtowin, an Indigenous view of the other. My name is Greg Hill. I'm the ordained senior curator of Indigenous art here at the gallery and your host for tonight's talk. I'd like to acknowledge the land where I'm living, just north of Ottawa, in a place now known as Chelsea, Quebec. My home, as well as the National Gallery of Canada, are situated on unsurrendered, unceded, traditional Algonquin territory. That means that title to these lands has never been reconciled or settled, which makes me a little uncomfortable as an uninvited Gungehaga Mohawk guest or occupier on these lands. Acknowledging this, I wish to express my support for Algonquin land claims and my hope that these long-standing matters will be resolved sometime soon. Tonight's program, this 1.5-hour event, complements the exhibition Rembrandt in Amsterdam, Creativity and Competition. The Wâpahtowin in the title for this evening's event comes from Gerald McMaster's center at the Ontario College of Art and Design University, the Center for Indigenous Knowledge. I'd like to introduce Gerald, Professor of Indigenous Visual Culture and Critical Curatorial Studies at the Ontario College of Art and Design. With over 40 years of international work and expertise in contemporary art, critical theory, museology, and Indigenous aesthetics, Gerald McMaster is a prominent leader representing Canada and Indigenous art at major events in the arts, such as the Venice and Sydney Biennales. His early interests focused on the lack of representation of Indigenous artists in art museums and raising concern for how culturally sensitive objects were displayed, represented, and cared for. His projects have created awareness and understanding of transnational Indigenous visual cultures and curatorial practices. Gerald's going to be this year's keynote speaker at the University's Art Association of Canada's annual conference. That's the National Organization for Art History Academics. I've known Gerald for a number of years now. I used to work for him as his research assistant when I worked at was doing contract work at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now known as the Canadian Museum of History. And we were working on the First Peoples Hall there. I'd also like to introduce Rick Hill, Tuscarora artist and knowledge keeper from Six Nations. He's a holder of traditional knowledge and stories on wampum belts. His work has been a great deal working for the return of wampum belts from museums and on the recovery of knowledge from these belts. As a community-based historian, he has re-examined the nature of the treaty relationship with the newcomers, especially the one that started with the Dutch in 1613. Hill attended the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the University of Buffalo, where he taught for over 20 years. He also served as assistant director for public programs at the National Museum of the American Indian and wrote the interpretive script for Scano, Great Law of Peace Center in Syracuse, New York. Rick and I go not as far back maybe as Gerald. I certainly have known of his work for a very long time. I have much respect for the work that he does. And I think really our coming together has been over the two-row and it's kind of reinvesting in the two-row and how it's been coming up over the years. So it's been great to work on this project together. So with that, I mean, I trust you'll enjoy this pre-recorded presentation, the stories and the conversation. And we'll gather together afterwards for a live discussion and a question and answer period.
I'm thankful that you're well and you're all watching. I had a few things I wanted to share with you, some background to my experience with being in the Netherlands and seeing some Rembrandt paintings. But I want to start with this. Where would Canada be without the fur trade? And the symbols of the fur trade can be seen in this company crest from the Northwest Company, which was the forerunner to the Hudson Bay Company. So we see the ship and the canoe for domestic travel, for gathering the furs, and the ship for international travel, taking the furs from here over to Europe. But that symbolism that we see in this design comes from the two-row wampum, the story behind that. And we have an example of that belt and the part of the exhibition, because it really represents the meeting of the Dutch people. They came in their ship to meet with the Mohawks, we say about 1613. And this wampum belt was put together, these two paths. You imagine the ship on one path and the canoe on the other path. And that was the very first treaty that we made between our people. And it's important to remember that, because this was all happening during Rembrandt's life. I'm sure he was totally unaware of that, but our reference to the Dutch is through this. They said that the canoe and the ship are going to be linked by these three chains, these three concepts of ideas, which I believe still have application today. This idea that we're first going to have this friendship, and that if we nurture this friendship with a good mind, meaning we have equal mutual justice, that we'll always have this ongoing peace. And that was the desire of our relatives. How they ever came to that in 1613 is still a bit of a mystery to me because of the language differences, but they were able to arrive at this. But what was interesting to me is at the same time, our artists are looking at the Dutch. These are two Seneca hair combs from central New York, show two very different kind of views. On one side, we see probably three Seneca chiefs sitting in a council, maybe the Wolf clan chiefs. The other side, then we see these Dutchmen with their short pants and their big broad hats. It was with much anticipation that I went to the Netherlands, and I think it was about 1985. In fact, Gerald and I were there on a artist visit, and I was traveling on a Haudenosaunee passport. We issue our own passports because we maintain our stance that we're still an independent sovereign nation. And it was a little tricky getting through customs, but after a while, I don't know, after about 45 minutes or so, they welcomed me as the Dutch said that we welcome you as our oldest treaty partner from North America. And I felt quite victorious at recognizing that. But trying to imagine, what did our people go through as they're trying to kind of look at each other even back then? So now we see the Dutch then in their waistcoats, their hats and various things. The antler on the left almost looks like the guy is holding a rattle. Something's going on there. We don't know the whole story, but it's interesting to me. Now let's take a look at these two images. The very first time we saw a Dutch man coming through Seneca country, this hair comb was made. He was a census taker, riding on a horse, first time we saw a horse, and carrying a gun. And the other one there, we see him the man kind of waving with holding his musket and his little puppy jumping around at his feet. But it raises some very important questions. How did we see each other? What did we see in the Dutch that maybe was very different than what Rembrandt saw? And the fact that Rembrandt didn't really kind of look at Indigenous people raises another mystery. But I think there's an important message here. This is a statue that stands outside of Albany, New York, which is near where that treaty was made. And it has underneath it this word assiduity. And I never knew what that meant until I finally looked it up on the internet. So we see the Mohawk or the native figure on one side. We see the Dutch figure on the other side. We see their big ship in the middle. Assiduity means to pay constant attention to what one is doing. And I think that's important because that's what happened at that treaty, the two-row treaty, to pay constant attention to each other. And I think through this exhibition, we're going to try to relook at what does that mean now today, especially in the art world? How are we paying constant attention to each other? So that's my short presentation. I'm going to pass it back to Greg and we'll continue on.
Thanks, Rick. So Gerald, you had a discussion, I think, way back with Kitty Scott about some of your work. with Wâpahtowin and some of your work in terms of Indigenous views of the European as an other. And I think that kind of work has led to what you're able to contribute to this exhibition. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Thank you, Greg. Thanks, Rick. Rick brought up a story about a time we were in the Netherlands together back in 1985. And it was when we were invited by the Dutch who were celebrating the called the Amsterdam Festival, the Holland Festival, sorry. And they invited Canada that year. And so they invited the museum where I was working to bring an exhibition of contemporary artists. So we went over there, and I went ahead several weeks to install the exhibition. And I was with a film crew. There was a European film crew who were there to, they knew we were there, so they wanted to follow us. And so I said, I'm going to the airport. I have to go pick up these artists who are coming in from Canada. And so if you want to come with me, you're more than welcome to. So we packed up, went to the airport, to the Schiphol airport, and we waited. And of course, you know, the artists would come off. I think there was Clifford Miracle, David General, Robert Hoole, Carl Beam, etc. And no Rick Hill. So, you know, the camera people are, you know, have their camera up waiting and nothing. So people said, well, he was on the flight with us. We don't know where he is. So we waited and waited and waited. And I think Rick said maybe 45 minutes. It seemed like 2 hours we were waiting until finally he comes out, and we realized what had happened was that, you know, Rick, in all his stance was to go on a Six Nations passport as opposed to a Canadian passport. And they held him up in customs, and he refused to give his Canadian passport, and I have to hand it to him. He just waited him out, and we didn't know what was going on behind the scenes, but that's what we heard. That's what Rick was telling us. Until eventually they let him go, and they came out, of course, and that was kind of funny. That was way back in '85, and so this idea that for us going, it was my first time in Europe. It may have been Rick's, I'm not sure, but it was my first time going to Europe. And sure enough, this notion of seeing one another and going to a foreign land had always been intriguing to me. And of course, I'm sure that's what later Europeans coming to the Americas perhaps were quite interested in. But of course, albeit it was a very different time. That was 500 years ago. This was 500 years later, when you can fly over and be there very, very quickly. But the idea that Rick was saying, he said, how do we see each other? And I think that was the kind of moment of 500 years ago, and even 1,000 years ago with the Norse who came in through the northern part. But this idea of Wâpahtowin, which we say in Cree, is to be able to see each other. How do we see each other? And it was a subject that has intrigued me now for a number of years. And it's a lot of the kind of work that I'm doing in Toronto at the OCAD University with our research center here. And it probably in part was why Kitty Scott and I, Kitty's the curator at the National Gallery, a deputy director, I think she is, approached me about perhaps contributing to a perspective on this exhibition of Rembrandt. And of course, I had never thought of it before about coming up against this, I don't know, an artist who is larger than life, and through history, he's written about tremendously. And so here, you know, having an idea, even a perspective about Rembrandt, kind of threw me for a loop for a moment. But I think once I thought about it, and I thought, well, if we start looking at the time period, as Rick had pointed out, this early time period of relations between Europeans and Indigenous peoples was an exciting period. And the National Gallery folks noted that the exhibition itself was taking place during a period which was once referred to as the Dutch Golden Period. And I think that that idea was being re-examined, that it's no longer being treated or thought of as the Golden Period, because what lay behind it was this notion of colonialism. And of course, as Indigenous peoples, it seems like we've been defined by colonialism. That's the meta-narrative that defines us. And I think what Rick has said and others are saying today, we're not always defined by colonialism. You know, we've got our cultures, we've got our points of view, we've got our perspectives, we've got our voices in which we define ourselves by. But so it's this curious relationship of contact of 500 years ago that has intrigued me about, okay, so Europeans have a history, and we all know that history of how Europeans have viewed Indigenous peoples. Although Rembrandt wasn't part of that group, but certainly his contemporaries were, and later descendants had ways of depicting and representing Indigenous peoples. But never in history has there been, or very rarely, I should say, very rarely in history have there been any stories or pictures or books or essays that show Indigenous responses to Europeans coming in a visual way. And Rick showed a few of those in the Seneca combs, in which the artists were depicting early Dutch arrival. So it's this that intrigued me, and I think that that's what intrigued Kitty when we started talking about perhaps there might be a way to respond to Rembrandt and the time. So it meant that we had to go back to those moments during that period of colonization, during that period of when the Dutch were seeking alliances with Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous communities. Because we must remember that Indigenous peoples had tremendous power and position. And that's why Europeans were seeking alliances, because at that point, they hadn't overpowered Indigenous folks. It wasn't until, well, it was during that time, and 100, maybe 200 years later, where the gradual spread of European diseases. And there is upwards of a dozen different kinds of diseases that have been documented that decimated Indigenous peoples all across the Americas, North, Central, and South America. And historians often say about upwards to 90% of Indigenous peoples were wiped out. So that the decimation, the great dying, as sometimes it's referred to, creates an imbalance of power, so that it allowed more Europeans and as colonists and settlers to come in and governments, newly forming governments, to start to take land away, so you move from this position of equal power to one of unequal power. And I know it is a comment that's made by scholars such as there's a scholar by the name of Pratt who talks about contact zones. And these contact zones are areas of where there's an unequal alliances or power relations, an asymmetry that takes place, so that you start to see this gradual taking over. But I think when we go back to these early moments of connections that Rick was pointing out, and where the two-row comes into play during this time, was a period when Indigenous peoples were on par, on an equal basis, so that you could speak from a position of power. And I think that was an interesting moment. So this idea then for me and Rick and others to begin responding to Rembrandt was perhaps to look at that time period, to see the early Dutch and how did Indigenous peoples begin looking at them. And also not just looking at them, but perhaps also considering what's in it for me? What's this relationship in it for me? I know that they want to trade with us, so they've got something I want. So you find this period of trade where indigenous peoples were responding by wanting all these different kinds of goods in exchange for furs at that time, tremendous amount of beaver pelts, from which Europeans were interested in importing to Europe so that they could turn them into these hats, etc. So indigenous peoples were really just responding to the times, I think. And so this equal exchange, this equality that set up alliances, the trading partnerships that took place, and finding that different European powers were actually creating alliances with different indigenous peoples here in the Americas, because of course we had our enemies, and I know Rick and you will probably can talk about the enemies that Haudenosaunee had on our own lands. And so I think Europeans understood those kind of relationships that were happening then. So they just took advantage of that. But it was an interesting period, and I think providing an indigenous perspective of the Dutch and of Rembrandt of the time was something that that started to take place. And I think that that's where developing these labels. So as you read the labels, hopefully you'll be able to get a sense of a different kind of perspective of how, when you examine the paintings, oftentimes you don't quite see the forest for the trees or the trees for the forest, you know, because through art history, we are taught to see in a particular way. But, you know, when we start to examine what's behind the paintings, what perhaps some of the stories behind the paintings are, you start to see a different story. And I think that that's what we were trying to provide.
Yeah, and I think it goes a long way to having the exhibition. You know, as we're saying, it's like it's really a critical re-examination of the Dutch Golden Era, as it's called, and really looking at that and thinking about, well, you know, what made that possible? What slavery and global expansion, colonialism, what were the effects in the time and that are still lasting today? And so your labels and panels that pull out some of that information, that query some of what's happening in the paintings, making connections to the fur trade, to diseases, as you mentioned, I think really starts to open up a lot of conversations. And I think we're talking about this too as a visual examination. What are views the other like in the Seneca combs? How did Haudenosaunee people see the Dutch? How was the way that they were interpreting what they were seeing affected by what they were, how they were also seeing how they were being represented? I mean, what the difference between the kind of metaphorical thinking that's encapsulated in the Tura Wampum and other Haudenosaunee devices of communication, and how the Dutch are the kind of thinking that they're doing, those processes being more, you know, having the written word and writing treaties. I'm just really curious about how, and I continue to be curious about, and maybe even more so with you know what Rick is brought out into the exhibition about how the two rows is a lot about a kind of ways of being together and understanding each other and moving forward through time. Peaceful cohabitation maybe in North America. How do we reconcile such disparate mindsets and ways of being that honor the values and of the Turo and the fact that this was exchanged between the Gahaga, the Mohawk, and the Dutch a little over 400 years ago, and and here we are bringing these things together again, kind of reminding the Dutch through a Rembrandt exhibition about this, and by extension, European peoples and Indigenous peoples. It's just there's so much to unpack, and I don't know if either of you have further thoughts on that.
Well, I have another story just to go back to '85 when Rick and I were in Amsterdam. There was a symposium or a conference that was held with the exhibition that we took, and so all the artists were there on stage talking, and at some point somebody, maybe it was Rick, because I think you were probably involved in repatriation at that time, or certainly the Haudenosaunee folks were involved in repatriation. So somehow the R word was uttered into the audience, and this guy, this anthropologist from Leiden, from the museum in Leiden, stood up and says, he says, "We're never going to send anything back to you. We're never going to give anything back." And everybody just kind of looked at him in shock, I'm sure. And I'm sure all the artists went, "What the hell is this guy talking about?" So he went on to explain. He said, and when we're talking about this 500-year history of Europeans taking things back, whether it's through trade or whether it was through any number of ways, how they could have collected something from North America, and they ended up in European museums, and in this case, Dutch museums. So this idea of returning perhaps what was stolen, if it could be proven, etc. But he just said, "Look, we're not going to send anything back. We're not going to give you, the Indians, back anything." And he said, because it represents our history of colonization. That's what they represent. And so when we think about that kind of, I mean, he was an older man, perhaps an attitude of his day. And we were young, we were full of energy. And I think those are the kind of issues that we were bringing up at that time, because our elders had been talking about stuff like that, because we were in a position of recovering both material and immaterial things to our communities. And so this notion of going, perhaps, Rick would probably describe it in a peaceful way, looking at the Turo. That's the kind of relationships we've had, that somehow, how do we maintain these relationships? But now we're finding is that these communities, these European museums, have changed over the years. And so they're thinking, okay, now we can set up the relationships, perhaps like they were, by lending, by borrowing, by giving back, by somehow setting up relationships with Indigenous peoples. But that was those early days, and we were stuck and we were caught. We were a participant in those changes and those debates, if you will. And I think the art, even though we were all contemporary artists, young curators, we were still also part of the debates that our people were going through, you know. To some degree, we're kind of representatives of that time, you know. So yes, of course, we stepped into a landmine, but I think that was to be expected. I don't know if you remember that, Rick, but that was.
No, I forgot about that, but it does remind me the words that that anthropologist said. I think it's something I kind of wrestled with when I was asked to respond to this exhibit, because in many ways, Rembrandt represented the epitome of that colonizing culture. And I'm trying to think of what good can we draw out of this? Even though as an art student, certainly studied his paintings and his masterful use of paint. Mm. But it raised this perplexing question about what happened to the Truro? What happened to our relationship with the Dutch? Now they celebrated the Truro, the 300th anniversary of the Truro. It's a great fanfare among the Haudenosaunee, and then last 2013 they did it as well. It's the 400th anniversary, and we made some contact. So think of this way: the Truro is the ideal relationship. The reality of that relationship and the interchange that took place is a whole other story. So some days I look at the constructive attributes of colonization, meaning we got introduced to a whole lot of new ideas, new technology. I mean, where would we be without the glass beads and the spun thread and the cloth that provided by the colonies? We wouldn't even be able to dress ourselves today as Haudenosaunee people in the fashion that we do. But the other things, and that's what the hair combs kind of depict to a degree. It shows the guns. That was a big element of the fur trade. It doesn't show the rum, and it doesn't show the slavery. In fact, the Dutch introduced the concept of slavery to our people, and that I think also jaded our relationship to Black people, because we saw them in that. That's how we first engaged them. We saw them as in this subservient role. So those things that came on the ship have a profound influence on the way that we look at the world today. At the same time, there's some things in the canoe that are still in the canoe. Our consciousness about ourselves, our belief system, our languages, as fragile as they are, our connection to this land. That's what makes it different. I got some good friends from the Netherlands today, and they come over every couple of years, and we have a great discussion about, okay, maybe our governments will never renew the Truro, but maybe the Truro represents an avenue by which the Dutch people and the Indigenous people can build a new kind of friendship and go way beyond whatever Rembrandt and his era didn't see, and now taking a look at this idea of us being citizens of the world. So I think there's something to explore in that as well, and art becomes the dialogue that can make this happen. When we were in Amsterdam, Gerald, I think I just felt so much like we were oddities on display. We were kind of, we all had this affection for some Dutch artists, and then we all had our own art to talk about. But in those kind of situations, you don't really build that friendship, right? So, and then we haven't responded. We haven't invited the Dutch artists to Canada. Maybe that's the next era of getting an art-to-art dialogue going on. And maybe that's where we'll learn a little bit more about each other.
Well, maybe this is where the situation that I think to some degree, maybe what Kitty had in mind is that by our involvement was to indicate that Rembrandt, to say to Rembrandt, your hosts are Indigenous peoples. You know, and artists and people coming to Canada or the US, whatever, you know, I think that they're reminded that they're on Indigenous land. And so I think this idea that there are hosts around across the country is to say to Rembrandt, you know, your host today, as Edgar Hieperberg often says in his art, your hosts today are the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and others, you know. But what I wanted also to add is that by looking at the Rembrandt works, both Rembrandt as well as some of his contemporaries, because I think that's what's in the exhibition. Looking at the work, doing a deep dive into the work, try to have an indigenous, well, my perspective, if you will, an indigenous perspective. But what it enabled me was to think much more deeply about the time period, maybe, looking at the work closely. So, and that to me was a very interesting exercise. So for example, when I was looking at the works, I was thinking about diseases, and this power imbalance that eventually led to more and more settlers coming into the country, and of course, greater trade imbalance that was taking place. I was thinking also of trade that took place, and that's really one of the main reasons that Europeans were different Europeans here in the Americas, and trading with indigenous peoples for raw materials, natural resources that to take back to Europe. Because, for example, I think it was the beaver pelt, which had almost been decimated in Europe. I know that the Russians were the biggest traders of beaver pelts and pretty well decimated the population in Europe. So they needed new sources. And I think that's coming to North America and discovering tremendous resource of beaver for decades happened. And so this huge trade in beaver pelts to make European hats. And of course, what happened, you had the beaver pelts being taken from North America, taken to Europe, and then Europeans coming back with hats. And that's what Rick was showing, that in the art, you could see these hats being worn by Europeans. And of course, hats were also traded and incorporated into indigenous cultures here. Also looked at the works, and I saw that during this period, and we don't think of it much, and when we look at the paintings, this notion of the colors, the color schemes. And I was quite fascinated by the fact that the color red, and if you look at some of the older paintings, red is usually a color that was worn by the clergy, the papacy, for example, or the kings and queens and the aristocrats, because the color red was so difficult to find and so expensive. And so when early colonists were coming into the Americas, particularly in Central and South America, they saw that indigenous peoples had already been using the color red from a tiny beetle that they'd found on cacti. And so by crushing up this beetle, they discovered that red could be used. So little things like that, and it became a huge market for Europe to come up with ways to import this little beetle back to Europe. And of course, that was very difficult in those days. So looking at the artwork and thinking and seeing this color red and how it was used took me back, of course, to begin thinking about this, the trading that was taking place of raw material back to Europe. Spirituality, I think, was another thing that I think indigenous peoples could relate to in Rembrandt and in other paintings, because, of course, European painters were very much absorbed by Christianity, and it came out heavily in their artwork. And of course, the spread of Christianity through the Americas of now, of course, is looked at in quite negative terms. But when you think of it, indigenous peoples have always been quite spiritual, and perhaps early in those days were quite open to a spiritual people that Europeans were. But when it started to become a part of the kind of the monster of colonization, of course, it turned into something quite different. I think that's why the negative effects of that. But I think this notion that indigenous peoples could relate to the spirituality, the spiritualism that is contained in the art of this time, I think was an easy thing to do. So just looking at that from that point of view. And I think just general ways of life, looking at of how you can see Europeans, the way they dressed, the way they acted, um, the way they smelled. You know, those things you take you back 500 years ago to this so-called Dutch Golden Period and this period of colonization. That's what looking at the artwork allowed me to do and to think about, and of course, I was really trying to see it through perhaps the eyes of the Haudenosaunee, who are really the ones that came in contact with the Dutch, certainly not the Crees like us from out west, but it's the way that we can look at artwork and look at and think that there are indigenous perspectives there, and you can perhaps look at kind of a conceptual ways and ways of seeing from our point of view at this early period and provide a perspective. And I think it was a good exercise, and I must hand it to the folks at the National Gallery for allowing us this opportunity, allowing me the opportunity anyhow to just examine the works, think about the works. By the way, I should preface this also by saying that I did my studies later in the 90s in Amsterdam. So I did go back to Holland in the end and do my dissertation at the University of Amsterdam. So I have a good connection with Europe, and particularly with the Dutch. And so it allowed me to revisit those moments of who the Dutch were, what were they doing here in the Americas, and what's the relationship today. And I think back in '85, bringing Canada back and bringing Indigenous artists back to Europe might have been a sign in retrospect. I don't know, but it made connections to me, and I think to Rick and I and others, reconnected the possibility of examining those early relationships.
I think that it's always been fascinating to me, this relationship and the exchange of the Turo between Haudenosaunee peoples, Gahaga, and the Dutch. That having an opportunity to explore that a little bit more in this exhibition has been really fascinating. I think what you're saying, Gerald, about what you did in terms of looking deeply at the work and pulling out things like making connections between the kinds of plagues that were happening, at that time in Europe, and the transfer of diseases to the Americas and the effects of that. We're finding, works in the permanent collection of the National Gallery to bring into the exhibition as well, that really kind of illustrate that in a powerful way, like the work of Ruth Cuthand and her beaded diseases. Beads are such a loaded item in a sense too, right? Because we're talking about the Tura wampum, which is a wampum belt made of strung together shell beads that were part of indigenous trade that was happening in North America on Turtle Island before any Europeans ever arrived. And then how that trade transforms into different materials and involves newcomers, bringing different materials from different places in the world, and it's a global trade. So the introduction of glass beads, and then how that material is taken up, and really there's a proliferation of new art forms across Turtle Island, and then all the way to what our contemporary artists are doing with beads, with a sense of this awareness of cultural history, our histories, important objects like the two-row, and then transporting that, from those days to present times, but even far off into the future. And I'm thinking of the work of Scavanati, who has made, a replica two-row wampum, and then coming out of her machinima work, which is cinema created in cyberspace, and she's a pioneer in that medium, where she has several machinima, but I'm thinking of the ones that do exactly that take history, bring it to us in the present, and project it into the future. And what she did, one of the things that she did was create a 5-row wampum belt that is for the year 3025, when human beings go out into faraway galaxies and have new agreements with alien beings. So you have, instead of a 2-row, it's a 5-row now, because it's an intergalactic kind of agreement and treaty way of moving forward. So there's all these different strategies, I guess, that we're employing to really try to close that gap between what I think a viewer would expect in coming to a traditional Rembrandt exhibition, and what we're doing with it. And Rick, there's been some pretty interesting developments, I think, in terms of the 2-row, and we're on the cusp of having a kind of an amazing opportunity to actually bring the historic belt to the National Gallery of Canada. And that I don't know if you have any more thoughts on what this could mean, or anything about that. That's in terms of how we're talking about this.
I think it's a great opportunity. When you think about it, the experience of the Haudenosaunee, with the Six Nations, with the Dutch, is really quite remarkable. But we also have to understand the experience of other Indigenous people in the Dutch was really quite tragic. So we're fortunate to have the luxury of having this grand agreement and this 2-row wampum. So I believe we have here at Six Nations the original copy of this belt that has probably been remade many times. And once you actually get to see it, it's a little tattered and torn, maybe symbolic of our relationship today. But the chiefs here at Grand River have agreed to bring the belt to the gallery and to present it for a few days, along with the oral history, our interpretation of the belt. So it's a great opportunity for the museum visitors, really for the whole city of Ottawa, to see the actual wampum belt and hear from a first-person point of view what this belt tells us about this relationship. We also have to remember the Dutch kind of industrialized even wampum bead making. They're really amazing. If there was an opportunity to make money, the Dutch were there. And we also have to realize, at least with the Haudenosaunee, we only engaged with them for about 60 years. And then, they were defeated by the English, and the English took over. But they left some profound legacies in treaty making and wampum making, and wampum use as a treaty protocol that I think still survives to this day. But also you mentioned then this new technology, and I think maybe we need to think about that. Yes, what would a new wampum belt between the Haudenosaunee and the Africans who were in the slave ships of the Dutch, or Asians or Arabs? So the problem with treaty making now it's just so focused on the West all the time. We always think about white people and Native people. And that, I think what this artwork that Scavanati's done is raises a point is, well, there's a whole larger world, even before we get to the intergalactic world, that we need to have those same principles of friendship and the good mind and ongoing peace to develop, particularly in this world and what's going on. So maybe the two-row can stimulate some intercultural exchange among people of color to say, what is our relationship to each other? And not get so fixated on when are the Europeans finally going to live up to their treaty obligations, and maybe change the nature of that dialogue.
Yeah, I wanted to respond, Greg, to, you mentioned some of the artwork that the contemporary artwork that you're putting into the exhibition, which I find quite exciting. In addition to the Rembrandt and his contemporaries, you've decided to put not only the two-row wampum, for example, in there, but you've also considered and are going to be putting some contemporary artwork. And I thought that that was quite good because, you know, these ideas aren't going to go away. And I think these kind of relational ideas with Europeans and outsiders are still going to be around us for a long, long time. And so two works in particular, that one you brought up about Ruth Cuthand's beadwork series of diseases. It really points to those early contact days, right? It's really about, you know, and it's apropos that we're talking about this and this, that you put this small display up because we're going through COVID right now. Of course, COVID-19, we're all being inoculated. We've discovered, scientists have discovered, you know, antibodies. They've discovered a way in which to defeat perhaps this COVID, but, you know, 400 or 500 years ago, that was non-existent. Nobody knew about microbes. You know, the microscope hadn't even been discovered yet. And so they didn't realize what was really killing people. You know, they had names for some of these diseases because you could see it, and but you couldn't see what was killing it, what was behind that. And so what Ruth Cuthand has done is, nowadays, of course, they are these microscopic views, and she beaded these beautiful roundels of a microscopic view of all these different microbes. And as I said, there were over a dozen of these microbes of different kinds that were decimating indigenous people. So the simplicity of this beaded medallion, that'll be on display, I think will bring, says so much about that time period and what it meant. There's a beauty, a terrible beauty in looking at these microbes up close. You know, when you think about it, they're absolutely beautiful, but you realize that they decimated so many of our peoples up and down the Americas. So thinking about that, I think in the exhibition during this time, what colonization brought with it, you know, was something totally invisible that wiped out people. So that as part of a kind of discussion about intercultural, intersectional, is, I think, to me, is part of the conversation that we're having. And another work that I think you're putting up is Kent Monkman's Triumph of Mischief, right? And that's
Yes.
a huge painting that Kent has done. And talking about intersectionality, you know, talk about different periods, both in art history and just historical events that are taking place in that painting. And so I think the audiences, visitors to the gallery, really have to start looking very closely at what's going on. You know, this beautiful landscape he's got in the background that he's borrowed from 19th century Hudson River School painters. But what he's done is in the foreground, you start to see history playing out. It's all convoluted, it's intersectional, things are happening at the same time. Picasso, you know, is standing there holding an African masks. Meanwhile, behind him, there's, I think, three black males who are posed like his famous Mademoiselle painting. I think that's going on. You have Duchamp's urinal stuck out in a corner. You have references to George Catlin and other painters who were painting like Picasso, appropriating, perhaps borrowing, stealing images of indigenous history. And so Kenton is ubiquitous way is responding to all that, what history, what was appropriated. And so he's reappropriating and really calling attention to that time period of contact. He's also brought in, I noticed if you look in the paintings, indigenous references. There's some objects from indigenous artists. I think he would probably say they were works of art created by indigenous artists who today would probably be referred to as two-spirited or berdashes, etc. So he responds to that. He's also, there's references to little people, which are, of course, stories in most indigenous cultures about little people and these very, I don't know what you call them. They're stories that perhaps are real, but they're told by indigenous people. So that's going on. There's a white buffalo that he puts in there, which is, of course, is a sacred being when it does come in front of us. But all these interactions that are taking place really responds to that, the 500-year history of our relationships, not only just to indigenous, but even to African relationships. So I think that painting, The Triumph of Mischief, goes a long ways to if we're doing a deep dive into analyzing paintings, that's one we can really look at and try to understand this great history that we've gone through. So I thought that was another. There are others, of course, that you've brought into the exhibition. I think that you've also brought in Rick, I don't know if you wanted to speak about Greg Stats. I know that he's done a very interesting work that Greg is putting in. I think it responds to the two-row. You've already spoke about Scawanati's interpretations as well. I think these are very interesting works.
Well, Gerald, you raised a good point that in order to understand the contemporary indigenous work and even really to understand Rembrandt, it takes a conscious effort to study the piece. Too often, I think we look at something, we think we get the point, and we either laugh or cry and then move on. But it's in the metaphorical meaning, the deep sometimes meaning of that. It's in the manipulation of the imagery, whether it's paint or digital things, or that's where the artistry comes. So I think it does take time to stand and contemplate, kind of the old art gallery approach. You look at a painting, you get absorbed into it, and you walk away with some kind of consciousness about what the message is. So too often, because of the way things are going now, we're lucky if we spend 15 seconds looking at a painting in the art gallery. Well, for Rembrandt and this new work, particularly Kent's work, it requires us to spend some time looking, examining all of those details you just mentioned there. I think with Greg's work, Greg's drawing upon this concept of this condolence, but that condolence is also something that happened whenever we engaged with each other. We had to wipe our tears, or remove the obstructions from our ears, and to clean our throat so that we can engage in healthy people. So Greg is trying to take a look at us as a current generation, because of inherited trauma, because of what colonization has done to us. We're carrying a lot of hurt, a lot of unresolved grief. How do we liberate ourselves from that colonial past? And I think then his work becomes, so in other words, if you understand condolence, understand the role of wampum in that, and understand the powerful words, that particular work has a great meaning to me, because in many ways it's like he captured something that can't be explained any other way. That this thing that happens when you go through ceremony, when you look at the power of wampum to heal. So I think those are other ideas that we need to take a look at. In one sense, Indigenous artists, we're great at satire. We're really good at critiquing the West and all of the stuff that happened. We're a little bit less reluctant to critique ourselves and who we are now as colonized people in this recovery that you talked about. So I often used to say, is Rembrandt's work a real reflection of what was going on, or was it his idealization of what's going on to make the society even more grandeur, to make the people he depicted more noble because he was commissioned to make them look good? And we got to think that same thing about ourselves. Are we just trying to ennoble our own sense of indigeneity, our own history, ennobling the past, or do we need to take a harder look at who we are in that timeline of colonized history? So I used to say that Indigenous art has to liberate itself from its own historical gaze. We're always looking backwards to try to recover that great beauty of the past until we look right in the hard mirror, whether it's a stone or canvas or digital imagery, and reflect on who we are as individuals, but as a collective people. The genes of many people, including the Dutch now, run through our veins as well, through our intermarriage, intercontact. So we got ideas going back and forth. We have genetic material going back and forth. And so the legacy of the Turo, at one point, the Dutchman said, what happens if people from the ship want to get in the canoe? And many of us feel that, what's going on in Indigenous universities, or people want to understand indigeneity even better. And the Mohawk man said, well, it's true. People in the ship are going to want to get in a canoe, and people in the canoe are going to want to get in the ship. He said, how about this? Whatever vessel you find yourself in, you'll be governed by its laws. And to me, that was a very profound, but also very kind of mystifying thing. So when you and I are in the art gallery, are we bound by the old Western canons of art? When you come to the reserve and go to the Woodland Cultural Center, is there a different kind of aesthetic going on? Well, I think we've realized art can be the thing that transcends that boundary between the ship and the canoe, but it can also represent what it means to grow up between the ship and the canoe. So I think we have to take a look at this artwork as a reflection of our experience since the time the Turo was made. What kind of people have we become? What are our neighbors like? And maybe projecting an idealized future. In other words, the principles of Turo are being reflected in this artwork in a whole different way, but it's still that intention. We want to live in peace. We want to live as ourselves. One of the mandates of the Turo is that the laws of the ship would not try to steer the canoe. But boy, that didn't last very long. And look at the Indian Act and residential schools, on and on and on. So maybe the Turo ideology, replayed by our contemporary Indigenous artists, will set the new stage for a new kind of social dialogue. How are we going to find that place of peacefulness, of respectfulness, of cooperation that our governments could never find? So maybe the art gallery can become the new place, that new, I don't want to say sacred space, but a new space in which that dialogue can take place like we're doing today. And it doesn't have all the political polemics and all of the other things that always muddy up the waters. So I think if we look at the artwork that way, it's giving us a window not only into what happened and who we are, but something about who we all may become in the future.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I said that, when I was saying, and I was quoting someone else who said that the colonization isn't the meta-narrative that defines indigeneity. I think you responded in a very interesting way. On the one hand, when I was talking about Ruth Cuthand and Kent Monkman, that responds to that idea of colonization, right? That's the political side. That is the critical side. That really talks about contact and relations, not only today but in the past. Whereas on the other hand, as you're saying, Rick, if you start from the position of indigeneity, then you're looking at Greg Statt's work in a very different way, right? Because it really isn't talking about that to some degree. It's talking about this very important idea of condolence from your community's perspective, or Scawanati's work about the Turo, that begins from the ground of indigeneity, without without any kind of interference, from these kind of political outsider ideas, but rather it starts from a community level. It starts from the story. It starts from the culture. It starts from the ground up and the relations with the land and the community. So that's where I see the potential. And as you say, that where the gallery can start to participate in these kind of discourses, Indigenous art isn't always political, and but it's also something much more grounded within this land. And I think that there's so much going on today in contemporary, by contemporary artists that are really that don't respond in that activist political way, but starts from a different source. That's where I'm seeing a lot of work today.
I think there's power. You're speaking from a powerful place when you're speaking from a cultural perspective, like in Greg's work, like in Scawanati's work, and and there's you can go so deep within that, and I'm thinking about this in the context of the exhibition and how we're inserting those works into the Rembrandt narrative, and kind of really going back into history and pulling this out as a kind of reminder, even as points of discussion, as ways of recovery, what we're talking about. So these are processes that artists are actively engaged in, and both of you have really contributed to that in different ways, and this presentation. And I think it's really, we've talked about that too. It's such an important opportunity, in addition to the Rembrandt exhibition, to experience these things and to have these discussions. And I thank you very much, both of you, Goa, for this conversation and for our previous conversations, and for what you've added. Unfortunately, we're kind of running out of time here, so we have to wrap up. But it doesn't mean that these conversations won't continue, and I do look forward to those occasions. So thank you both very, very much.
Well, thank you, Greg. And I wanted to also thank everybody at the gallery. It took a lot of courage to do this thinking and adding this component to it. So I'm hopeful that your audience appreciates the opportunity they have to also experience this Rembrandt in a whole different way. Now to you too.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And I echo what Rick said about perhaps our labels will have visitors looking and spending more than, I think they usually say people spend about 2 or 3 seconds in front of each work. So maybe they spend at least 20 seconds on each work, and hopefully these labels will help to guide them in that direction. So thanks to you and to the gallery.
Okay, so we're going live now to respond to some questions that have come up in some cases, to reflect more about some of what was discussed. It's really interesting to review this recorded conversation, because there's so much in it. There's so much to think about. And Gerald, I mean, your contribution in adding that textual narrative, yours and Joanna Wâpahtowin, we didn't really talk much about what else has been added in terms of there's not only an Indigenous perspective, but there's a Black perspective, and there are also additional works by contemporary Black artists, Marija Kitenge Banza, for example. So I mean, the very thought-provoking. I know that you won't be able to go through the exhibition and spend less than more, or I should say more than a few seconds in front of many of the works. Rick, one of the interesting questions you posed in relation to the two-row was, how are we paying constant attention to each other? And how do we maintain those relations? Do you have some examples?
Well, that's a great question, because sometimes the constant attention we pay is in the middle of the road when we're fighting over who owns the road, or we're in front of a judge, or we're trying to stop them from taking our kids from our home into the social welfare system. So there's a different kind of attention that we're talking about now, a different way of looking at each other. And I can actually feel this momentum growing, particularly young Canadians, who sometimes even have to jettison the thinking of their relatives, the things they heard around the dinner table. It's not just the Truth and Reconciliation, but there was a movement of trying to find better relationship. And the universities and colleges, I think, provide the new forum, as well as the art galleries, for this new kind of dialogue. There's no answers to it yet, because we're just beginning to engage on that. So, and I think this issue that came up with these 215 kids, it presses us to pay attention to that matter now. People were kind of getting tired of hearing about residential schools and asking, why can't you just get over that? Well, this forces us to ask, or to say, this is why, these are the kind of things why. So we still need to move on the issues, but someday I think we got to get back to that ongoing peaceful friendship means we can trust each other. And that's what's missing right now. We still have a tough time trusting the government, trusting the churches, trusting the police, and trusting some curators. So we got to work through all of that stuff ourselves.
I think, I mean, one of the things I enjoyed about the discussion were some of the stories. And I think the connections personally that come up, you know, what are our relations? What are our connections to Europe? With, like, as is pointed out, we think so much it's about what are Western views of the other, what are our views of Westerners, like there's reversing the gaze, there's the views of others, but I wonder, Gerald, you mentioned kind of in relation to that, like how we, at one time we had really strong like positions of power, and then through those relations, through what happened with disease, that there was a shift. And it's kind of like that notion of alliance to irrelevance. And I wonder, I think, you know, things have really changed now again in so many ways. And I wonder if you wanted to reflect a little bit more on that, maybe in relation to some of the really eloquent descriptions you gave of some of the artworks, or if that is something you want to think about.
Well, first of all, thanks to Greg for the invitation, and Rick for your eloquence as well, and the conversation we had not long ago. You and I go back for many years, and as well as Greg. I think the time period in which Rick and I began in the 70s and 80s, you know, both he and I, and even into the 90s, and the kind of work that we were doing, the struggles that artists had. Back then, we had no curators. I think I was the only curator back then. I think Tom Hill as well was a curator. So the kind of struggles, I think, really remind us of the ships, the two-row, the separation. It wasn't because we wanted that separation, as I think the two-row talks about. It talks not it's about a position of power. That was really about having your own ways and your own position. Whereas I think what we were fighting was the after effects of cultural erasure. Of they talked about genocide that was happening in the residential schools. I think they're trying to shift the focus to a kind of a cultural genocide. So the idea of Indigenous people and artists, I think, we're struggling within that system of erasure and cultural genocide. So what we were doing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was to challenge, I think, Canadian art, the Canadian art establishment, the museum establishment, institutional establishment, as much as we could, to push and to do and be the best we could possibly be. And what happened, I think, in the as a result of that, was that we also gave rise to a new generation, such as yourself and others now, that have taken over the kind of pressures that we were putting on, and we're seeing those kinds of changes slowly across the landscape of this country, and thinking of how the redefining what that landscape is. And of course, as I said earlier, that we're not always defined by colonization, but we should also look at our own landscapes. We've created those landscapes, we've lived those landscapes, we've defined those landscapes. And I think now it's the onus perhaps is on institutions, if they are to see this land not as, obviously they're looking at themselves as settlers and colonizers, but they're here forever. So that kind of relationship that we talked about, and that's shifting and changing, I think is for the better. And it's going to take some time for it to change, but I'm seeing that change, and certainly that new generation of curatorship and the artists that are coming by and doing just fantastic works and really articulate young people. I'm so proud of that. Rick and I, when we look back on it, it seemed like there was only a handful of us. I mean, there was more than a handful, but I think so much has changed, and we can only look back on it now and think of the groundswell that has taken place over the last number of years, and to say, well, I think that we've left something behind. And but I also wanted to mention or respond to Rick's point about the two-row. That two-row exists, but at the same time, there's stuff going on between the two rows, which I always find really, really exciting. Because what happens between the two-row is a mix, a really creative mix that goes on, I think, between artists, amongst artists. And I think that that's where the art world also has to consider itself, because it is part of that between those two rows. And that's where to me, the most exciting happenings are today and will always be. But at the same time, I think keeping the position of Indigenous people in a sovereign position in their own canoe has to be respected by those in the ship on the other side.
Thanks, Gerald. I mean, I want to give Rick a chance to look back on his experiences, which of course are very different than yours. and his view and perspective. But I wonder, Rick, if I can put you on the spot just to just give a brief explanation of the Turo, because I think a lot of our viewers, some of them came in later, some of them missed it, and if you wouldn't mind, just a quick rehash of what the Turo wampum is. That was really kind of the genesis, at least for the visual additions and interventions in the exhibition.
It's only been here for 400 years. If you don't know it now, it's too late. That's just a joke. The Turo then is this foundational agreement that affects all subsequent treaty making. Treaty making is really the building and maintaining of constructive relationships. So if we look at it that way, there are principles involved. We did agree we're going to coexist on the river of life together. The ship and the canoe are going to go down that river of life. They're tied together. We did talk a little bit about how the ship's not going to try to steer the canoe, and the people in the canoe aren't going to try to steer the ship. But there's a good example of maybe how things have changed. We can no longer sit silently in our canoe as the ship continues to destroy the water or the environment or oppress our people. So I think the Turo was a springboard to the future. There's principles there. And I think that's what we're trying to wrestle with now. How do those principles apply today? But anyway, this wampum belt, now wampum are tiny shell beads that come from different clams and whelks from the Atlantic Ocean, woven into these symbolic designs. They're used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabeg, the Wendat, all the Cherokees, people all across at least northeastern the U.S. use these for diplomatic purposes. So that's why this belt is so important, because it represents the great hope that our ancestors, the Dutch representing, you could say, then all of the Europeans, and the Mohawk representing all of the indigenous people, their hope that into the future we would find ways to have a peaceful coexistence. And that story that I told about being in the ship or the canoe and being governed by its rules, I think that still also applies today. When you come to our community, when you engage with us, there's a different set of standards, different social etiquette, different ways of doing things. But when we enter the academy or go into the art gallery, there's also different rules. I'll add something to that, though, because Gerald mentioned, it's been a difficult journey to try to get Indigenous art represented in the major institutions like the National Gallery of Art. One time, I think in 1992, I was at a conference in Washington at their National Gallery of art critics. I got invited to this thing at the last minute, and when I arrived there, I looked around, and of course it was all white men, and I basically say, are there no art critics of color? And then they said, he couldn't make it because they knew one black art critic. And so I got invited as a stand-in because certainly there was nobody they considered to be a native art critic. Well, during that conference, the art critic from Time magazine came up to me and said, if Fritz Scholder and Alan Hauser are the best you have, I don't want to see the rest. And that really kind of struck with me about how even the contemporary stereotype of Indigenous art, we certainly celebrate Fritz Scholder and Alan Hauser as some of our early modernists, but his mind was just so made up that our art will never measure up. And then another art critic says, we're not social workers. We're not historians. We just write our opinion. And my response was, well, sometimes it's better to keep your opinion to yourself. So we've had to face a lot of negative attitudes, not only about natives, about the artwork. And I think Gerald and I, though, kind of did parallel, but a different track. I got more focused on helping the community produce art. In other words, we can spend our whole life trying to decolonize the art gallery, but it's a whole other job to try re-indigenize the meaning of art in our communities. But it's a how do you want to say it? It's a dual responsibility, because our communities also kind of grew a little stale when all of a sudden the end of the trail image became the most popular image you saw at an Indigenous art show or a craft show at a powwow. So this reclaiming of identity through art is very important. And it's an ongoing thing, because the identity is often changed, just like the treaty relationship, just like being on the water. The identity keeps flowing, it keeps changing, new things come up. So Greg, you're right here, this space in the middle is where a lot of our young people find themselves, neither secure in the canoe or secure in the ship, and maybe they are making a new nation.
Yeah, you talked about James Earl Frazier's end of the trail, right? Talk about a sculpture that needs to be torn down. Since we're at a time when so much is being torn down. But let me, Greg, if you will, just bring it back to the Rembrandt exhibition. And thinking about that time period, because we are talking about Rembrandt, we're talking about the Dutch Golden Age, as it was once called, talking about his contemporaries as well. And what was interesting to me in doing this exercise and being invited by the National Gallery was not just the looking at the great works from the past, but when you look at something, you also have to put it in perspective and perhaps begin to think about, you know, the question, well, what were Indigenous peoples doing at the time? Well, of course, we were doing so much. The cultures were alive, they were well, they were producing great works of art. And what it forces us to do, and perhaps even institutions now like the gallery, to think, okay, well, that's the Dutch golden period. What about an Indigenous golden period, or what an Indigenous responses, or what was going on at that same period? And why do we not see that in our institutions? And I know that the National Gallery has been doing some great things for the last 15, 20 years about representing that time period. So I think these kinds of discussions are so critical now. And we don't always have to compare. And I think that's what Rick was bringing up with that 1992 conference, is that there was always a comparison. Ours is better than yours, you know? But what we have to realize that visual knowledge is different in all cultures. And I think that that's what galleries and institutions have, and particularly in Canada, if it's called the National Gallery of Canada, has to begin to understand the visuality, the Indigenous visuality has its own long history. And we have to know more about that. And it's so important, you know, it's everywhere. And so looking and working on the Rembrandt obviously made us understand that even to a greater degree, that we need to know more about an Indigenous visual history, you know. So anyhow, I'm happy to have participated. It was great to see Rembrandt again. And I'm sure I won't stop seeing him or acting as a host to welcome him in the future again.
It was great. I think you're right. I mean, I think we don't need to compare, but we do need to be aware. It's like so much of this work has been done in isolation with no consideration of what's going on in the rest of the world. So this is a way to look for relevance, to look for connection. And I thank you both for, the great contribution you've made towards that. And really enjoyed this process, this discussion. I'm learning so much outside of my own area. And that's thanks to everybody. That this approach to the exhibition reflects really a different curatorial process, a more collaborative one. And it's as you mentioned, Gerald, it's part of a process, a journey that the National Gallery is on to be more open, to be more reflective, to be more responsive, and to be more aware. So thank you both for being part of that.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you both too.